Okay, everybody, welcome to the first edition of the Hockey Wales Schools webinar. Today's topic is going to be around teaching inclusive hockey, and this is our first webinar, which will be released in spring term 2022. So just to put in the picture then, we are going to be releasing regular webinars to upskill teachers CPD. We're always going to be releasing applied topics to make it relevant to you and your specific roles, and we're targeting this CPD at teachers, teaching assistants, or anybody who is a school sport coach delivering hockey within our schools, both at primary and secondary level. Delighted to announce that we've got Disability Sport Wales as our guest lecture today. We've also we've got two employees on the call of theirs who are our staff experts today in Donna and Sioned. So before we begin the webinar, what I'd like to do is for those two people to introduce themselves, and then as we progress through the slides, we're going to talk about different things which can enable you to develop your practice to make it more inclusive. So Donna, can I introduce you first? Do you mind just introducing yourself and what role that you've got at Disability Sport Wales?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Steve. My name's Donna. I work for Disability Sport Wales as an education and training officer and have been doing that role since around 2019. I also work in Flintshire for Aura as the Disability Sport Wales Development Officer as part of the community programme. I've been doing that role for around 18 years.
Thanks, Donna. And Sioned?
Morning, everyone. I'm Sioned Williams and I'm the Disability Sport Wales Intersport Officer. We'll go into a bit more detail later on what Intersport is. But yeah, I also have a hockey background, so hopefully I can bring in some real life experiences into this webinar today.
Well, brilliant. Thanks for introductions, ladies. And obviously we've got some expertise on the call today. So hopefully from this, as teachers, TAs or school sport coaches, you'll be able to take away some key messages, help inform your own practice, and enable you to deliver more inclusive hockey as a result. So first things first then, we're all aware, I think we've all delivered certainly on the call within schools, hockey as well as other multi-sports. And as always, we do come across various barriers to participation. So the first thing that we're going to discuss with our two experts in the room is around barriers and how we can potentially break those down to enable us to deliver more inclusive hockey. So I'll hand the floor over to you first, ladies, to talk through your individual bullet points and what are the key barriers that we're aware of and potentially how we can overcome them.
Thanks, Steve. Go, Sioned.
Sorry, I was just going to say, I think from my personal experiences, the perception of hockey is one of the main barriers, because you say the word hockey and people instantly go, oh, dangerous sport. They all automatically go and think of their bad experiences in school, where I think if you overcome that, you can kind of see how much fun it can be. When I used to deliver in schools, one of the first things I would do would be to do a drill by taking away the sticks. So therefore you take away the danger, but children automatically kind of understand what the skills are. They need to bend their knees, not their backs, whilst taking that danger away. That also gave time for teachers to kind of ease into it, thinking, do you know what, hockey can be safe. I don't know if you've had similar experiences going into schools, but it's taking that potential danger away and kind of dropping it back in slowly when you think people are comfortable. And obviously when we talk about disability and stuff like that, that also gives you time to kind of read your audience, understand different abilities, physical and with learning abilities and stuff like that as well. But yeah, Donna, have you got any examples? You've done this.
Yeah, I think that links really closely to this area of perceptions and experiences, and that might be about hockey specifically, but it might also be around either from a staff or from a child's perception of what they are and aren't able to do. And I think sometimes it's a case of really understanding about shifting that focus to things that people can do. So if there's elements within hockey or whatever game or activity that you're delivering, either in a PE or an extracurricular type environment, it's a case of breaking that down into what things can a child do. And if we focus on that in terms of functional ability and something that a child is able to do within the sport of hockey, I think that breaks that barrier down, because then shift and our focus changes. So it's a case of working with that individual child, working with your team, whether that be in a team of coaches or a team of TAs, but also to make sure that when you're delivering an activity, we're not thinking about all the things that someone can't do. And I think sometimes we bring with us our own perceptions and experiences of potentially another child that we've taught before, or our own experiences in that particular sport. So it's a case of really recognizing within ourselves and trying to push that to one side and shift that focus to what a child can do. And I think that will be a really positive shift for anything that you're delivering, whether that be in hockey or something else. And also linking into that individual and parental preferences. So again, you've mentioned, Sinead, about, you know, some sports and activities having a perceived danger within that, or a child perceiving that they don't like or they've never played a particular sport. I think in a teaching environment and a school environment, we'll always have a range of experiences in terms of things that children have been exposed to, things that people have played before. And if we're really honest, that does play a huge role in how successful some of our sessions can be. However, by overcoming that, by differentiating and recognizing that we are going to have huge discrepancies in terms of ability level within our children, within our session, not including impairment within that, and also experience levels. We're never going to get a group of 20 to 30 children and young people that have the same level of ability, same level of experience, knowledge, and desire and motivation to play. So within that group of 30, you may have a disabled child that has a physical impairment, you might have a wheelchair user, you might have someone with an intellectual impairment, and their ability level might fit within that spectrum of ability within that group. So I think whilst the focus today is about inclusion of disabled children and those that may have an impairment, I think if we recognise it in the truest sense of inclusion and the wide spectrum of children that we would have in our sessions.
Yeah, and I'm with good points, Don, and I'm with Sinead on the first one around, you know, potentially modifying the session or certainly the equipment. So I know I've seen colleagues of mine deliver hockey with a simple cone in a child's hand. They've used tennis rackets instead of sticks, so they've got a wider circumference to manipulate the ball with. And then they've relaxed things like the rules, etc. Because I mean, myself as a child being in a P lesson, it felt like the whistle was non-stop blowing, purely because it hit the back of the stick, hit a foot. There was a tangle of sticks together, and I think sometimes relaxing those rules and let the kids play and learn for themselves before implementing those can be other key factors as well. So really interested to note as well. And I think, Donna, you've touched on preferences there around individuals and parental. What about the teacher preferences? Could that play a key part in whether or not, you know, hockey is offered as an inclusive sport?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that touches on the next point, Steve, around culture, knowledge and awareness. If hockey is something that historically has been a sport and activity that's been played in the school, that will play a part in terms of what choices people make in terms of the teachers' awareness, but also about how disabled children are included within the session. Our hope is, from a Disability Sport Wales perspective, that every child would engage in physical activity and sport in a school setting, especially when we consider that up to 80% of disabled children are in mainstream schools. We really need to make sure that we can do everything that we can to make sure that teachers feel like they have that knowledge and expertise, or know who to go to ask the question if they need any help and support. And I think we have lots of positive examples of where children are being included really well in hockey and in football and a wide variety of sports in a school environment. However, we do sometimes have situations where a child may be doing an alternative activity, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that when we cover the activity inclusion model, about the thought process that goes into how do we include people in sport and activity. Our hope certainly would be that for hockey, that there are lots of different ways in which the sport and skills associated with the sport can be modified to make it appropriate for any child including those with an impairment, to engage in this sport successfully. So yeah, teacher awareness, knowledge is huge in that. And I guess it goes back to my first point really around perceptions and experiences, and making sure that we focus on what can a child do. If it's a case that a child is struggling with grip with a hockey stick, you know, is there a different kind of stick that we could use that they could practice the skills? However, it might be thinner, it might be lighter for that particular child. So if a child has a physical impairment like cerebral palsy, for example, it might be something much lighter that a child is able to engage in that activity with their peers. But there's just a slight change on the equipment that's used, or the way in which the game is set up to be positive for that particular child.
Okay. Any more to cover on that particular topic, guys, before we move on?
Yeah, I suppose accessibility, I mean that very often, you know, when we talk about disability and impairment, it's the first thing that people think of in terms of physical access. So when I've talked about this as a barrier, I was meaning from the perspective of where does the activity take place?
Yeah.
And sometimes, especially in a school environment, it might be some slight changes about how and where we set up an activity to make sure that it's going to be accessible for some children. And that might be due to balance and coordination difficulties. It might be because the child is a wheelchair user and the school field is particularly boggy at certain times of year, and it's going to be really difficult for them to be mobile in that environment. It might be a case of splitting across a schoolyard area that they may have, but also the accessibility of equipment. So mentioned a little bit about having some alternative equipment available to make sure that might be better for some children, young people. It might be a case of changing the colours of some of the equipment that's used to make sure that it's further accessible for those that might have a visual impairment. It might be just using things in a slightly different way to make sure that that equipment and that activity is accessible. And I think we always have, whenever we do any work in and around schools, is the accessibility of the school hall environment. You know, I don't think that, definitely at primary level, I don't think many that I can think of have a separate sports hall environment. Generally, we have this space in the centre of the school that is used for lunches, for break areas, for breakfast club, has a lot of equipment stored in. So it's just making sure that we're using the best of what we have, because we need to be realistic in the environments that we're working in. Okay.
Well, thanks, ladies, for that coverage around barriers. I think we've covered all of those 4 points in great depth and detail there. So we'll now look at sort of how to overcome them in a little bit more detail over the following slides. So the first thing we're going to discuss is the activity inclusion model.
Yeah, if I make a start, and then Sinead, if you come in with some hockey specific examples, if that's okay. So we have the activity inclusion model, which is an adaptation from Stevenson and Black. And this model puts the participant at the heart of any activity that we're planning or delivering. You'll see around the outside area, we have those initial parts in green and red. So we have open activity, parallel, modified and specific. And these are the different ways in which we can set up and structure an activity to make sure that it's inclusive for disabled people. So by the fact that we have different areas, it's showing that there isn't a one size fits all. And this can be something that we set up for a particular session. It might be that we set up a particular scheme of work over a term, and there may be different ways in which we can set the activities up. So if we have an open activity, this would be something where we don't need to make any changes or adaptations. The session is delivered as we would plan it for the whole entire group that we're working with. If we have parallel activity, this is where we would differentiate, and we would split people either according to their impairment or according to their ability level. So for example, with if we were splitting based on impairment, we might have a group of wheelchair users playing hockey together in one particular area.
Yeah.
We might have another area where we would have children and young people with an intellectual impairment taking part together, or we might have a group with sensory impairments together. Realistically, in a school environment, in a mainstream school, we're going to have a mixture of children, some with impairment, some not. So a common example that might be more familiar to people is where we would split people based on beginners, intermediate, advanced. We see that a lot in environments like swimming lessons, where we would split people accordingly. So that might be something that in a school environment that you wish to consider, so that we're not having our most physically literate or our most competent child playing in an environment with someone who has never done hockey before, never experienced the sport, needs some kind of changes to the equipment or the environment for them to take part. So those are ways in which you could split a session. Okay. Also, when we go to modified, that would be where we make some changes, which we're going to talk about a little bit more on the next slide. So it might be making some modifications. That might be to the rules, it might be to the way in which the game is played, it might be to the surface that we're playing on, the equipment that we're using, the way in which we group children together. Yeah. So I would argue that very often in a school delivery, most of the activities that that we see delivered would be modified, because we're always going to be hoping to differentiate that activity to make sure that it's appropriate for the group. Yeah. And then we have specific activity. So this would be where you do a purposely planned, separate and different activity. That would happen quite rarely in a school environment. It sometimes happens with a specific disability sport, where we might use the principles of reverse integration. So we might use a sport like bocce, for example, to take that into a school, and the focus is on those children that might be wheelchair users or electric wheelchair users. However, all the other children would play in that environment. What's really important for us to understand is that participant is at the heart of that model and decision-making process. And whilst it might be appropriate in some circumstances to go for specific activity, what we would hope is there's lots of different ways in which we can modify hockey to make sure that that is something that we can deliver in a school environment.
Brilliant.
We also have, around the edge of that, we have considerations of the activity, impairment, ability and setting. And that's just to put it into context, again, linking into the heart of the participant. So you might find that on one particular week or for one particular term that we need to do lots of parallel small-sided activities to make sure that that's appropriate. Yeah. We might need lots of modifications. However, as confidence grows and competency in that particular activity and familiarity with the sport, we might find that we're more on the side of open activity. Yeah. As time goes on, but this isn't a static model, and you'll see that it is presented in a circular format, because it's not a static, that if you do modified activity that will always be the case. And you might also find that you might have disabled children that might be the most competent person at this particular sport. Yeah. And some of those modifications are for the non-disabled children in that environment.
Okay. And when would a teacher typically apply this model? Would it be in the planning phase or during delivery? Well, where would you position this in terms of supporting them implement this within their own practice?
I can just jump in there. I would personally put it into the planning, because at least then you're prepared for whatever audience you've got. Yeah. For an example, when I'm doing my training sessions, I coach the youngest group out of the club, and I've always got a backup of, if this doesn't work, what can I revert back to? Yeah. And I think the key is start small, so implement small changes. So if we're thinking of running parallel sessions, I'll split the group by their ability. Yeah. Usually that's with age, because they've been playing hockey for a longer time or they're new to the game. usually split the group. The most experienced group, I would give them kind of set rules. So basic stuff with hockey, can't touch your, the ball can't touch your feet.
Yeah.
You can only use one side of the stick and keep the basics in there.
Yeah.
Where with the newest group or the mixed ability group, I would kind of take away those rules. The only rules that I would give would be safety consideration. So keep your stick low on the ground, don't use it like a golf club. I might change the ball to a bit of a spongy ball so it doesn't travel as fast. You can just change the game to make it work for those individuals. So definitely put it into the planning, but understand as well, you can plan and plan and plan, but you might not get that perfect session that you've got on the paper. It's fine to adapt as you go along, because what you've learned from that session can be built in to your next week's session or the next session you run.
And I think a big part of that, if you want to go to the next slide, Steve, from a planning perspective, and also from an ongoing adjustment and reconsideration about the activity that you're doing, we use the concept and the principle of STEP. So we use that acronym as a way to be able to plan inclusively, but also to deliver inclusively and make those shifts and changes. If people apply this at each of those stages, it should be inclusive, but not just for those with a level of impairment, but also for all children within that group, as we've mentioned before. Yep. So STEP stands for space, task, equipment, and people. And I think a lot of you, hopefully that are watching this, you'll probably find that if you aren't aware of this, you already use parts of it informally, but hopefully what this will do is just give you a really easy acronym and a step process that you can consider and go through if things aren't quite going to how you've planned it, or if you need to make some of those changes. So space would be being realistic within the environments that you're in. Does it make it easier or harder or more appropriate if you make the space larger or smaller? And those are things that you can factor into your session plan about if you wanted to make it easier or if you wanted to make it harder, you can use STEP to plan that in. But also if you've got specific children within your group with a certain impairment that you want to consider, how could you use STEP to make this more inclusive or more appropriate? So you might want to list the ways in which you can make changes if you have a wheelchair user, or if you have someone who's deaf, deafened or hard of hearing, or with a visual impairment or physical impairment, and so on. Task, how can you change and adapt the activity? So Sean had just mentioned a great example of that, about how you would split that in a parallel session. And hopefully what you'll see with STEP is you can use that alongside the activity inclusion model within each of those sections. So Sinead's given a great example there of a parallel activity with some modifications from task, for example, within that. So ways in which you can apply different rules or apply different conditions to make sure that it's about getting people involved in hockey. It's about them succeeding. It's about them having fun and building skills. Now, if some of the conditions that Sean had mentioned on one side of the spectrum, if those were applied to those that weren't necessarily familiar with the sport, they probably wouldn't have fun. It would probably be really difficult, and it probably would mean that motivation and engagement would drop. We've mentioned equipment quite a bit, and we're not for 1 minute saying that everyone needs to go out and buy disability specific equipment, because more often than not, in people's PE cupboards, you will have different size sticks, you might have some different weighting, you might have some different balls that you use for different activities. But I suppose what we're signposting you to with this acronym is about thinking outside the box, that, you know, hockey doesn't have to look a certain way. If we know and understand what the principles and what the skills are associated with that sport, how can we do that and adapt that to make sure that children have a positive experience playing this fun and exciting game in a slightly different way? We might be using a tennis ball or something else that is more visual for someone to be able to see. We might be using specific colour cones, because we might have a child that that finds those easier to see and depict in an environment that's quite busy, especially in a gym hall. You know, using yellow and white cones on a school gym floor might not be the most visible colour to use, whereas the same, you know, using green cones on a school field probably isn't. So it's just using those kind of thoughts and contrasts about who would that be useful for. And whilst, yes, we're saying it in the under the guise of that would be more appropriate for someone with a visual impairment or someone with an intellectual impairment. However, in different environments, you might find that benefits the wider group of children that you're working with. And then we've got people. So who's involved in the activity? How many people? How do you group people together to make sure that people have a positive experience that supports them? Do we buddy children up so that we can learn from each other in terms of peer-to-peer work that you're doing? Are there ways in which we can structure that so that we know? And in a school environment, you probably have lots of children and young people that you might not necessarily put together in certain environments, because you're trying to make sure that we're not having certain behaviours happen, or we know who's going to work well together. Do you have learning partners? Is that how you're going to continue that outside of the classroom environment into a PE and school sport environment? So that's how we would use STEP. Hopefully, if you take nothing else from today, it's about how you would use the activity inclusion model alongside STEP to be able to make appropriate modifications for those with an impairment, but also for a wide range of children.
So I guess that the key message then is to make it child-centred, place them at the heart of your planning delivery, and ensure that there's not a one-size-fits-all approach to this. So don't deliver like a blanket generic lesson that would you deem for to fit everybody, when obviously everyone's got such different needs. So I think that's the sort of key message I'm taking away from this. But Shauna, do you get anything else to add to this particular slide?
Just to make sure that whatever task or game you're working on, it's achievable for everyone. So it might not look the same for everyone, but everyone can achieve something, everyone can succeed. And if you can see someone struggling, then don't be afraid to go backwards. Okay, that's not working. How about we try this? And you'll just learn as you go along. I've been teaching hockey for years now, and even now I sometimes go home and will go, oh my gosh, what have I done? That didn't work. That was terrible. But you take away learning and you implement changes for next week, and you come back thinking, right, that went better.
Yeah.
This was achieved. This was achieved. And the more you practice them, the more you play, the better the children will get, and the better your understanding and confidence as a coach will be as well. So yeah, just keep going, and nothing's perfect.
Yeah, and I think, you know, making it challenging but achievable is critical there. And I think as coaches, teachers are all guilty of trying to always progress the session. But I think you've hit the nail on the head, Sean, about, you know, the opportunity to also regress as well. And that isn't seen as a failure of you as a teacher, or a failure of the child maybe not being able to reach a level of competency. It's just simply stripping it back a little bit further to enable them to achieve a level of success at a certain level before they then progress eventually at some point. So yeah, really good, some key messages there to take home. And I think those two slides are really informative in terms of how we plan, deliver, and also assess against some of the curriculum outcomes when we're delivering our sessions. So thank you for the contributions to those two. So you're probably all wondering, well, okay, so we've learned a lot about the theory. How can we put this into practice, and what additional resource and training can we access to further embed our learning around this particular topic? So ladies, just want to talk us through some of the stuff that are on this slide regarding resource and training opportunities that teachers can maybe tap into.
Yeah, so if I talk a little bit about Intersport first. So Intersport is basically a project that has a number of programs within one kind of hierarchy name, which is Intersport. We have Intersport for the national governing bodies of sport. So Hockey Wales are currently working through Intersport NGB.
Yep.
We've got Intersport Development, which is tailored for local authorities. So each local authority will have a certain standard and will be working towards goals. We have Intersport Third Sector for third sector organisations, and we've also got Intersport Club, which
Great.
would be beneficial for teachers to be aware of. If you go on our website, you'll be able to search the nearest Intersport accredited clubs near you. So that would be perfect basically for you to signpost any children that enjoy hockey sessions in the school. Go on the website, find your nearest club. And if they've got the Intersport logo or badge, whatever, next to their name, it means that they're either working towards Intersport ribbon, or they're working and progressing through to Intersport Gold. And what Intersport is a toolkit to support clubs to be more inclusive. So it looks on qualifications, different policies, and just basically gives them the support they need to become an inclusive club. So yeah, if you can find a club with Intersport, you know you'll be in safe hands. And then the Intersport series education events and resources. I'll just touch on the Intersport series events. We haven't hosted many, to be honest with you, because of COVID, but we are looking now to implement some in the near future. So what they are basically events where a number of sports come together, usually under one roof, and offer loads of opportunities for children. So you could have hockey, football, rugby, wheelchair basketball, boccia, all on the same roof.
Great.
And the idea is that children can come in, have a go, see what they like, and hopefully progress to join a club.
Yeah.
And then we've also got our resources that you can find on intersportseries.com or maybe .co.uk. Donna, do you want to go through that a bit more?
Yeah, sure. So we had a programme, an online series of lesson plans that have been developed with an education consultant alongside a number of national governing bodies. So if teachers, TAs, anyone working in education wishes to register, you'll see the link there on the intersportseries.co.uk. You'll also find this detail on our website, disabilitysportwales.com. People register and they will get access to a series of resources that are mapped against Curriculum for Wales and mapped against the area of learning experience in there. So it's not meant to be a curriculum in a box. It is a guide for how you can put together inclusive lesson plans, and we'll consider things like STEP and AIM for how those can be put together. So hopefully that will be a useful resource, not just for hockey, but for any sport or activity that teachers are delivering. I'd strongly recommend it. The resources are great, really useful. Those can be downloaded and can be implemented into your schools and environments. We also have on the Disability Sport Wales website, we have a link to what training we have available. So we do have a UK DIT, which is disability inclusion training, from levels 1, which is e-learning, level 2, which is digital classroom, and then level 3, which we're hoping to return to fairly soon in terms of our face-to-face delivery. We also have a suite of training that's available specifically for teachers and TAs and those working in education that follows that same path. And we found recently that when we've delivered those sessions in a digital classroom environment, we found those really accessible to those working in education, either in PPA time or in twilight sessions or lunchtime sessions. So if anyone is interested in any further training and any further detail or signposting to different resources that we use and work with, we also work with Autism Wales, and they have some training available specifically for those working in education to learn more about autistic individuals and those on the autistic spectrum. We also have a programme called Admiral Play Together. So this is linked with our partner Admiral Insurance, and this is aimed at Key Stage 2 children and young people, and it's an inclusive learning programme for children that can be delivered in the school environment, so that, and the focus is about playing inclusively with your friends. So that is something that if you are interested in that, again, you can access some details on the disabilitysportwales.com website, and hopefully our details will be on the next slide as well if you want to get in touch directly.
Brill. And then in terms of the resources on the Intersport series, that they're free, they're downloadable, they can access them sort of straight away, Donna, once they register?
Yeah, absolutely. So they'll get a check-in code. So you'll register your school, how many children will be benefiting from the resource. You can register, if you wish to, you can register your school and make sure that any staff that are using that get the check-in code. If it's something that you want to share across the school, or individual teachers can sign up to that themselves.
Okay, and separately from a hockey perspective, if you want to sort of do a teacher specific course, we have got our leadership award in hockey coaching, which we can offer, which again is heavily weighted around teaching inclusive hockey. So if there's any interest from teachers on that, to do that award, we run regular training. We can deliver bespoke training internally or externally. So if that is of interest to anybody listening, we can certainly facilitate that for you as well, and set that up at convenience to yourself, whether that's in term time or during half terms. So just to finish off then, I know that we've divulged a lot of information here, a lot of good practice sharing. So if you do want to follow up separately with any of us who've been on this webinar today, all of our contact details are on the screen. Obviously different purposes to the email addresses and staff that are on the call, but certainly from a Disability Sport Wales perspective, reach out to Donna or Sioned. And from a hockey specific perspective, then I would be your point of call there. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's webinar. I'd just like to thank Donna and Sioned for their insights and expertise. And I look forward to putting on our next webinar in summer term, which will focus more around the new health and wellbeing curriculum. So thanks for that, both. And thanks again for everybody's contributions and for listening in.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you.